Welcome guys to part 1 of my first documentary mini-series. We're going to be diving into the first Punic War. So I'm going to be walking you through the pretext for this war, going through each and every step of this 23-year-long conflict between two ancient superpowers. The war would have been fought between 264 and 241 BC between the mighty powers of Rome and Carthage. And in this first episode, we're going to be diving into the eve of the war, setting up the battle and the war, and trying to investigate where each faction and each power stood before outright conflict started, and to see what led to the spark that ignited this bloody war. So let's go ahead and take a look first at Carthage. Carthage was originally a Phoenician colony that was established in 814 BC on the northern coast of Africa. The Phoenicians were located initially in modern-day Lebanon, and they had very good, even prolific seafaring capabilities. They established colonies all along the Mediterranean. Carthage was one of them, as I said, founded in 814 BC, well before the foundation of Rome, which was, according to Rome's mythology, supposed to have been founded in 753 BC. So that's about 100 years after the founding of the Phoenician colony in northern Africa that would grow and become Carthage. Now, Carthage would become one of the more famous, of course, of these Phoenician colonies, and Phoenician, the origins is why we call the Carthaginians the Punic powers. And Carthage as well developed into a large agricultural power. The coast of North Africa would have been much more plentiful and would have had a much more reliable climate when it came to agriculture, and so they were able to develop a huge agricultural base and actually had surpluses, and those surpluses they were able to ship abroad. And in combination with their agriculture, the Carthaginians kept up with the tradition of Phoenician naval supremacy, and they established a huge trade empire. They were famous for their eventual construction of a naval, the circular naval harbor in Carthage itself, and the trade network of Carthage was incredible. The Empire of Carthage initially was just the nearby area around the original settlement, but as the colony grew and grew, it essentially took over the land around it, and instead of paying subsidies and paying fees and fines and tributes to the African kingdoms, Carthage was eventually able to subdue these and was able to in turn get tributes from them. Carthage then expanded, took over the northern coast of Africa, and when we find ourselves at the beginning of this war, Carthage has significant holdings along North Africa, Spain, Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. If we look at Rome, on the other hand, as I said, Rome was, according to mythology, founded in 753 BC, and it had a reign of kings. The last of the kings was ousted, and in place rose a republic, and Rome then went on to fight with its neighbors, the Latin Leagues, the Etruscans to the north, and the Samnites to the south, and would eventually kick out the invading Greeks, who were led by Paris of Epirus. And in doing so, by the time of the Punic Wars, the Romans controlled all of Italy from the Po Valley all the way to the south, and they had not yet expanded past the Italian peninsula. Now let's go into the analysis of where both of these factions stand in terms of their army. So Carthage was a colony, and as it expanded, it essentially kept its citizen body centralized. That is, in terms of each of its expansions, whenever it would conquer a new people, it would have a treaty with them, and instead of bringing them into the Carthaginian body essentially and making them citizens, Carthage instead made them give troops in times of war and pay an annual tribute. And so in this way, the Carthaginian core, and that is the citizen army, was very small. Carthage in this case had to rely on troops sent by its allies, and also the recruitment of mercenaries, which is why Carthage is more notable for its fleet. That's where it amassed most of its forces, and when it came to the land armies, it would mostly draw these from the allies, as I've said, mercenaries, and at times of extreme danger, they would have deployed their core citizenry, who would have formed up in mass ranks with the spears, solid sort of Hellenistic formation, we could say, in the spikes, but they were not notorious for their skill. The Carthaginians were more of a sea and naval power. Now, when they did field their troops, they would have all sorts of different contingents. Notably, they were known for their use of the Numidian cavalry, which proved very, very effective and would have been very skilled at skirmishing, attacking, retreating, baiting enemies, and their true masterful use would most predominantly be shown in the Second Punic War. Carthage also was able to field African forest elephants and strong troops from Gaul, those raised in the Iberian Peninsula, and so it had a huge sort of motley crew that was able to meld together, and it had a big variety they could draw from, lots of strengths. But the weakness came that it was uniting disparate people from different cultures, different languages, and inherently the only central structure that held it all together was the Carthaginian leadership. So that was the general and his staff. So that was the central thing that held the beating heart of each army, was the Carthaginian general. Now the general for Carthage was someone who was appointed by the leadership at Carthage, and he would serve until Carthage decided to change him. So he did not have term limits, and because of this, the longer he was able to stay with his army, the more proficient it could become. And as it stayed longer and longer in the field, the troops could form a much closer bond, knew how to interact with each other, and would really identify with that leader. And over time, as we saw with Hannibal, they could become a very, very strong group of men. Now, the Carthaginians, however, as I said, had a limited number of citizen bodies, as well as the fact that they had to recruit relatively expensive mercenaries. This meant that when they were fighting their battles, they had to pick and choose when they fought, because an army was a very valuable thing. If it were to be lost, they would have to retrain it completely. And as I said, initially when you have this disparate factions coming together and uniting in this mercenary army, they have no experience, they're very hard to use, and so once you get a certain level of efficiency with your army, it's something that's very precious that generals who were serving for numerous years were not likely to want to risk. And so these generals would often be very cautious. On top of that, you have to note that these generals, if they were to fail, Carthaginians, the leadership, would be not afraid to punish them. There are often stories of Carthaginian officers or leaders being crucified by their own side in light of failures. Now we turn ourselves to Rome. So this is pre-Marian Rome. At this time, the legion actually comes from the Latin for levy. The legions were essentially citizens who were raised up, and with each consular army you would have 2 legions and 2 legions of allies who would form the flanks. And so the Roman legions were basically drawn up from the Roman citizenry predominantly, and in opposition to Carthage, whenever Rome took over a new area, it would try and bring them into the central body of Rome. So Rome had a long history of conquering a people and turning them into allies. It would make independent treaties with them, and it would not always, but often extend sort of an enfranchisement. It would make them citizens, and so with every new conquest, Rome would be able to grow its reserves of manpower, and this made it extremely resilient. This made it that the Roman legions could form up, and even if they were defeated, they could rise up again. Now, the legions themselves would have been formed in 5 different components. The first component would have been the velites, the skirmishers up front. These would have been the younger troops. Then after that we have the hastati, the principae, and the triarii. Now the hastati were the younger men. These would have been in their early 20s, less experienced but very eager. The next rank was the principes, late 20s, getting into their prime. They would have been similarly armed with the hastati, and then you have the triarii in the back, the most elder of the shock Roman troops, and they would have been armed with spears, and they would have been the crack troops. There was an expression that if something was hard going, the expression was it came down to the triarii, because they were always the last line. Now the fifth part would have been the Roman cavalry, the equites. These guys would have been drawn from the Roman nobility who could have afforded horses. Now it's important to note that as well as having these strong disciplined troops, initially Roman forces were not very capable. Just like with the Carthaginian forces, they needed training time, and so it took a while for the Roman general to meld them into a fighting force. But what Rome had over Carthage is that every time it fielded its legions, they had a set way to organize them. They had different levels of command. They had the consuls, the legates, the tribunes. They had all these different ranks going all the way down to the centurions. So even though the troops were fresh, the manner in which they would go about organizing and leading them would always stay the same, and that made it that much easier to regulate the training of their troops. Now let's move on to the general. The Roman general is a very important figure in his army. The general, it's important to note that a Roman general is also a Roman politician. They cannot be taken apart, essentially. Both are the same. In order to go up the ranks of a political life, you must also go up the ranks in the army. Both were entwined. You could not be an effective politician without being an effective general. There were some cases of people such as, those like, Cato, who might have made a name for themselves, or you could have had Cicero, an orator, people who were skilled and known for other things, but even those men served in the armies, and it's notable that the greatest generals, the greatest politicians, were both the same people. So let's go into this. The Roman general would have been appointed by the Senate, would have proposed it, and the people would have ratified it. The people leading Rome's armies would have been the consuls. There were 2 each year, and it's important to note that their term lasted 1 year. That meant that if you were going to get enough glory, you had to achieve as much as possible within that 1 year. That made it so that whenever an army of Rome took the field, there was tremendous pressure on the commanding officer to seek out glory. And so whereas the Carthaginians were more careful with the deploying and the movement of their troops, the Romans were very eager to engage in battle, seek glory, especially with the reserves of manpower. And so that's the main 2 differences. And where we end is that Carthage predominantly is going to be a sea power, Rome is going to be a land power. And that's where we're going to be moving into this war. Now, what were the relationships between these 2 nations before the war? We know that both nations had trade relations. They each acknowledged each other's spheres of influence. Rome, of course, had its own traders who would have come in contact with the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians were all around the Mediterranean, and so both of these had contact. There are references to 3 treaties between Rome and Carthage. These would have outlined where each faction could and could not trade, if there was exclusive trading rights, or if they could both engage in trade in certain areas. There were, inside of these treaties, assertions of essentially Rome would be left to its own matters in Latium, and Carthage would be left to its own in North Africa, and so they both kind of recognized their spheres of influences. The last part of the treaties would have come with the Greeks. Pyrrhus, he had come in and he was answering the call of the Greeks in southern Italy and Syracuse, and so he kind of stirred up the bee's nest, and he was fighting against both the Romans and the powers in Sicily, and so that kind of brought Rome and Carthage together, and they had some treaties together, although the extent of their alliance was not very prolific. There are stories of a Carthaginian fleet being within the vicinity of the battle when the Romans besieged Tarentum in southern Italy, but besides that, there was not an extensive mutual alliance taking place, but both of them were in direct contact. Now let's talk a bit about Carthage and its relationship to Greece. So as I said, Carthage was a Phoenician colony, and the Phoenicians had colonies all around the Mediterranean. Carthage grew to be very large, and it established its own colonies. At the same time, however, the Greeks were sailing merchant vessels, and they were establishing colonies, and this proved to be somewhat a tenuous situation, with both of these colonies in different areas coming into conflict. And so you saw both of these maritime powers fighting for control, and especially some of the main rub of it came down in Sicily, where Carthage had its power mostly to the west, Greeks had most of its power to the east in Syracuse, and so you had a lot of confrontations there, heavy involvement in Sicily, and they had basically relatively many battles for dominance along that island, because it was key for landing ships, refueling them, and controlling trade in the Mediterranean. So as we move forward, the Greeks actually won a great victory in 480 at Himera, which coincided with their defeat of Xerxes at Salamis and Plataea. So while the Greeks were able to push back Xerxes, they also had this big battle where they defeated the Carthaginians in Sicily. So this kind of puts it in a time frame where you know they're fighting the Persians, and as well the Greeks are fighting Carthage. And so all the while Carthage has this not so great relationship with the Greeks, conflicts are always boiling over in Sicily. And most importantly is going to be Syracuse. Syracuse is going to be a thorn in Carthage's side. Especially when it comes to Agathocles, the tyrant of Syracuse. He actually landed a force in North Africa in 310 BC, leading armies there, and he was able to defeat the Carthaginians there, and he went through, devastated the Carthaginian lands, and although he was not able to lay direct siege to Carthage itself because of the city's size, he was able to scare the Carthaginians and leave his mark, showing that Carthage was not going to get away with interfering with Greek affairs, and that Syracuse would always be there to fight Carthage. Now, next we have Pyrrhus, who comes and intervenes in Sicily and Italy, comes to the aids of the Greek. The Greeks were feeling pressure from the Carthaginians and the Romans. They call for Pyrrhus to come. Pyrrhus arrives with a large horde of Greeks, and as I said, they will go on to fight Rome and Carthage together. And it's possible, as I said, that the Carthaginians had a fleet that aided the Romans during their siege of Tarentum in 272 BC. In any case, Pyrrhus was defeated, and this sort of had a domino effect. It brought Rome into its power formally over control of all of Italy, especially southern Italy, and with that, Pyrrhus was ousted from Sicily, giving Carthage an edge in Sicily. So all of a sudden you have Carthage regaining power in Sicily, you have Rome in southern Italy. So these great powers are now elbow to elbow, and it's only a matter of time before both of their expansionist policies and their own interests come into conflict. Now we're going to start moving into the actual eve of war. While the deeper causes of such a conflict are difficult to trace, the incidents which provide the spark for wars are usually more obvious. So we're going to start off in Sicily. The start of this first Punic War is going to have its origins in Sicily, particularly at Messana. So that's going to be a city at the northeast of Sicily, looking across the straits at Italy. And it's in this city that we are going to have to analyze what happened. So let's go ahead and talk about the tyrant Agathocles, who had invaded Carthage in northern Africa. So what he did is he relied on mercenaries during his rule. However, when he ruled, he brought in some Italian mercenaries, some Oscan-speaking troops from Campania, known as the Mamertines. And when Agathocles finally died, in the political turmoil, these mercenaries found themselves without employment, and they decided to exploit the political chaos at the time. And so when they were admitted to Messana freely by the population, they turned on the population, slaughtered them, and used it as a base for more operations in the area, more raiding, pillaging. And so these Mamertines established themselves as a terror in that area and were raiding up and down the coast. Now, when we look across the straits, as I said, from Messana to Italy, there lies a city called Rhegium. That city held a garrison of 4,000 men sent by the Romans to protect it from Pyrrhus. However, those soldiers were also Oscan-speaking companions, and seeing what their fellow countrymen did across the straits, they decided to do the same thing, turned against the inhabitants of their city, slaughtered them, took their women, took their riches, and equally decided to form their own band and their own city there. Now, once Rome was done dealing with Pyrrhus, they turned their army to Rhegium, and they would not allow this breach of their own faith. And what they did is they sent an army in 271 BC. The city was taken after a long siege, and 300 of these companions were taken to Rome for a public flogging and beheading in the Forum. Meanwhile, we turn our attention back into Sicily. We must look at Syracuse. So in the aftermath of Agathocles and his demise, we rise Hiero. He was a skilled soldier and a shrewd politician, and he comes to power in Syracuse. He's able to break the power of the Mamertines after a decisive battle at the river Longanus in 265 BC. Seeing this reversal, the Mamertines are then going to send out embassies to both Rome and Carthage, pleading for help, pleading for some aid. Now, Carthage is the first to answer because it has troops in the area, and it wants to oppose Syracuse. Syracuse, again, as I said, had its tensions as a Greek city that had invaded North Africa, and Carthage really wanted to stick it to them. So Carthage turns and allies with the Mamertines, and what it does is it deploys a garrison force in the citadel at Messana. Now, at the same time, the Romans decide that they're not going to let this happen. They see Sicily as being too close to their newly acquired dominion of southern Italy, and so what they're going to do is they're going to send an expeditionary force to Sicily to aid the Mamertines. And so what drove the Romans to do this is actually the people's desire for war profiteering, especially the equestrians. The equestrians would have been the nobility of Rome who had the most representation, the most power when it came to making decisions, and they're the ones who would have not only benefited from the loot and the booty, but would have also supplied the arms and all the supplies, these rich government contracts essentially that they would have had in funding this war, and so they would have had a lot to reap the benefits of further conflict, especially when you're dealing with a war against Greek states and Greek cities here, which were supposed to have lots of wealth. So Rome decides that it's going to be engaging in this war. It's going to muster its forces, especially the consul of the year, Appius Claudius Caudex, has a desire for glory, and as I said, these politicians are elected for 1 year, and so in 1 year they have to get military glory, and so it's a combination of Rome's greed and also the quest for glory of her leaders that they decide to aid the Mamertines. But there's also the hypocrisy of the Romans, on the one hand punishing the Oscan-speaking companions at Rhegium, who had done the same thing as the Mamertines. The Romans had punished them, and now they're going to the aid of a similar faction, all just for greed and for glory. Now we're going to move on and to see what happens. So Rome is gathering a consular army and requests that a transport fleet from her allies meet at Rhegium. Now Rome did not have her own fleet. She may have had probably 10 ships, but this was really nothing. The Romans were not skilled sailors, and so they would have had their maritime allies at Locri, Tarentum, Elea, and Naples supply a fleet. At the same time, Hanno, a Carthaginian admiral, is at the head of a Carthaginian fleet, and he thwarts Roman attempts to cross the straits by Messana, and he says that he will not allow the Romans to even, and I put quotes here, to even bathe their hands in the sea. And so the Carthaginians are able to thwart repeated Roman attempts to cross the straits, and in a display of Carthaginian naval might, they actually return all the captured Roman vessels and prisoners. Claudius, however, who is the leading consul, is able to transfer most of his forces across the straits at night and arrange for the betrayal of the Carthaginian garrison at Messana. The troops, that is the Carthaginians, are evicted, and their officer is crucified by Carthage for this failure. So what we have here is the Romans and Carthaginians both trying to ally with the Mamertines. Rome, in the end, ends up being successful because they sort of are able to force the Carthaginians out. And so once Carthage witnesses this betrayal, it finds itself in the odd predicament of being thrown into a hasty alliance with Syracuse, in which they both decide to march in retribution on Messana, and it shows the degree to which all parties were acting out of opportunistic self-interest, that Carthage would ally with a longtime enemy in order to essentially punish this nation to the north that had so recently made an alliance and then betrayed them. Now, at the same time, the Romans are making their move and assault Hiero's camp outside of Messana. At first, the Syracusan cavalry, which were more notorious for their skill, are able to drive off their Roman counterparts. This is for two reasons. The Romans were not particularly well known for their cavalry forces, and also the difficulty of running the Carthaginian blockade of the straits meant that they were not able to disembark enough cavalry. So as I said, the Syracusan cavalry are able to drive off their counterparts, but the legionary infantry hold their own and are able to seize victory. The following day, the Romans then engage with the other Carthaginian camp. Initially, the Romans are driven back, and the Carthaginians, however, lose cohesion in their pursuit and are then routed by the Romans who have reformed and are able to push them back. These engagements were mostly large skirmishes, but effectively ended the siege of Messana. At this point, Claudius takes the initiative and pushes into Syracuse territory, burning and raiding along the way. Now, the city is too large and fortified to be assaulted, and Claudius must withdraw as his term of office expires. However, the bloodshed has only just begun, and the gears of war are turning. The year is now 263 BC, and Rome will be sending her consuls for next year, Marcus Valerius Maximus and Manius Octacilius Crassus, to Sicily. Each will be at the head of 2 legions and 2 allies for a force totaling of 40,000 strong. Romans are eager to gain both gold and glory in this new war. Legionary boots tread over vanquished enemies. The Roman military machine is mustering. Carthage is also, however, mobilizing hundreds of warships and thousands of soldiers for the cause. Their longtime holdings in Sicily are under threat, and the invaders must not be allowed a foothold. Initial losses were only a result of treachery, and soon the Armada will be in position. Both sides going into this conflict are supremely confident in their ability and anticipate a swift victory. However, neither could dream that the bloody 23-year war that lies ahead is going to claim thousands of lives on both sides and lead to a dramatic shift of power. And this is where I'm going to end this episode, The Eve of War. Check in the next time for the next episode as we start this 23-year long conflict. Thank you.